Good evening, everyone. I hope you are well. I'm pausing because I'm giving you the opportunity to respond and say good evening, as we would if we were all in the same room together. But I hope everyone has been enjoying the day, and I am thrilled and honored to be able to welcome Professors Jada Benn Torres and Gabriel Torres Colón to Sarah Lawrence College. This event is another event in the Belonging series, and the Belonging series really intends to encourage collaborative, collective contemplation of diverse marginalized communities' battles over and for belonging in the United States and around the world. Certainly, this is an issue, and it is a theme that builds on previous years' theme years, which include justice, e pluribus unum, difference and dialogue, and democracy and education. Hope you will join us in all the rest of the events for this year. So what we are trying to do with this Belonging series this year, thanks to President Judd's support, this focus seeks to advance the understanding of the term belonging as a call to action, as one side of a dynamic that is not an automatically enduring, always already reality, as something that, in order to be sustainable across time and space, requires all of us to engage in sustained ethical action. It is our hope that the conversations we will engage in together will be a positive step in this direction. So I am thrilled to bring to you, in collaboration with other colleagues here at Sarah Lawrence, the authors of Genetic Ancestry. And I know some of you second year human genetics students have already read it. For the rest of you who haven't, Genetic Ancestry focuses on the scientific nature and limitations of genetic ancestry testing. Chapters include what is a genetic ancestry test, genetic perspectives on the past, race, the elephant in the room, and genetic ancestry as empowerment. So our two speakers today are Jada Benn Torres, and she is Associate Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Laboratory of Genetic Anthropology and Biocultural Studies. Both are at Vanderbilt University. Her primary research area is the Anglophone Caribbean, where she explores, as you gathered, genetic ancestry and population history of African and indigenous Caribbean peoples. Right, so you see that's already troubling people's understandings of lines, of borders and boundaries. A second emerging area of her research combines the tools and theories of genetic epidemiology with anthropology in order to holistically examine health disparities. And this work focuses on women's health disparities with a specific focus on the uterine fibroids among women of African descent. Professor Gabriel Torres Colón is a cultural anthropologist with research and teaching interests in race, politics, sports, and intellectual history. His ethnographic research includes, and this is so wonderfully, really global, the politics of difference among Christians and Muslims in the Spanish enclave of Ceuta, racial experience in US boxing gyms, cultural understandings of ancestry in the Caribbean, and the relationship between everyday life and political ideology in Puerto Rico. So drawing on, and this is really crucial, anthropological, feminist, and philosophical insights, Dr. Torres Colón theorizes across his work how humans embody and politicize difference in various social contexts. And so his research and writing employ methodologies from the humanities, social sciences, and biological sciences. I am thrilled. These are wonderful people. I'm sure those of you who have met them already know that. And fantastic scholars and fantastic human beings. So I look forward to hearing from them, and please join me, Sarah Lawrence community, in welcoming these two wonderful scholars.
Well, to begin, I first want to thank everyone in the audience in person and online for extending the invitation and allowing us to come here today and share with you some of the work that we've been doing and the things that we've learned. In particular, I'd like to thank Vice President Ifioma Nakwano and President Christine Collins, as well as the entire team that pulled things together so that we could be here and enjoy engaging with you all today. So, Gabriel, you'll begin.
Of how mangroves and other difficult terrains like remote marshes and mountains have historically served as refuge for maroon communities throughout the Americas. The notion of Afro-Puerto Rican futures seems like a luxury. That is, thinking about the future can seem luxurious given the very real contemporary struggles faced by Afro-Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico and in the United States. So we want to take you tonight to the mangrove. I want to situate you in the mangrove, and to do that, I'll have you just observe the mangroves in the backgrounds and listen to the lagoon waters. All right, and so where are we? Where's that coming from? So here's the island of Puerto Rico. If you notice, the San Juan area would be on your top right, all that massive urban landscape you see there. And if you notice next to that urban landscape on the top right, you'll see that very deep green area that I've just put a circle around. That is one of the largest mangrove forests in the Caribbean. If any of you are familiar with Puerto Rico, you might know of El Yunque. I think it's the only rainforest on the U.S. National Forest Service, and that's right at the edge of that red circle. Notice also the deep green, but the mangrove forest is pretty big, and most people, including people in Puerto Rico, don't really know much about it. And so here is a little bit of a closer feature. You can see that that mangrove forest pushes right up against the greater San Juan area. The town of Loíza, which is historically recognized as the center of Afro-Puerto Rican culture, is on the right edge of that red rectangle. But the places where we would want to take you to is Piñones. That sound of the waves and the mangrove came from that mangrove forest. And so this is Piñones. This is the Piñones sector of the town of Loíza in Puerto Rico, where we have worked with the Corporación Piñones Integra, or COPI. You'll hear COPI for short today. That's a picture of one of the artworks outside of COPI. Here's another picture of the mangroves along one of the various lagoons. And Piñones is comprised of communities that are nestled up against these lagoons. And those arrows are pointing to the communities where we work, who we work with. About 2,000 people in total is the ancestral homeland of Maroons in Puerto Rico, of Maroons from other islands that would come to Puerto Rico. And it is also a history of a Black community that made a living for itself in along those mangroves. Mangroves, let me quickly say, might have a romantic, exotic sound to it, but mangroves are difficult terrains. There's a reason why Maroons communities came up in those places. They are tough places to live in. But nonetheless, at one time, who were former Maroons and former escaped slaves and free Blacks came to exploit the mangrove to produce, it's carbon. I forgot how to say it in English for a moment. Charcoal, thank you. From because that mangrove, the mangrove trees really is full of carbon. And so makes really good charcoal. And so that is the historical place of survival that we are going to situate you in. So we want to take you on a journey that we have co-constructed with our interlocutors and research partners in Piñones, but also Afro-Puerto Ricans in other communities. Collectively, we have utilized genetic technology and ethnographic research to help with existing efforts to establish Afro-Puerto Rican recognition, autonomy, and political action. Genetic technology is just one tool. It is a tool with a function that can only be understood alongside community efforts to restore and maintain the ancestral mangrove forest. Genetic technology must also be understood as a tool that is part of expressive culture. An expressive culture that projects Blackness as unequivocally Puerto Rican. Many of our interlocutors are artists, and we will focus on how artists working with the musical genre of Bomba give meaning to genetic ancestry. Our main objective tonight is to take you through this collective journey. And we aim to demonstrate how at the junction of genetic ancestry, environmental stewardship of the mangrove forest, and Bomba, our interlocutors strive for political autonomy, coalition building, and social flourishment, what we call the birthing of Afro-Puerto Rican futures.
So in terms of the structure of this presentation, we first want to relate how community-based research was really shaped. We used it to really shape the scientific agenda and then the design of our genetic work and the Cultural Ancestry Project. We'll share the genetic ancestry results that illustrate a unique complexity of the genetic legacies of African and Indigenous peoples throughout the region. We'll then shift our attention to how interlocutors have repurposed genetic ancestry as a tool for building diaspora and environmental autonomy, what we call mangrove politics. We highlight a diasporic expanse between Piñoneros and New York-based Garifuna and present some preliminary findings on the mangrove forest conservation efforts. Finally, we'll argue that how Afro-Puerto Ricans experience race, practice environmental conservation of their ancestral mangrove forests, and seek to affect change in governmental policies are tools not only for resisting structural racism, but imagining a future where they can flourish as equal members of a society. So to give you all some background on what the field looked like when we initiated this study, there were a series of studies that were published in the early 2000s. And these studies looked at Puerto Rican genetic ancestry. And some of them are actually pictured on the screen. And these findings generally confirmed already existing ideas about ancestry, but specifically the island's tricultural heritage from Europe, namely Spain, from Indigenous America, and parts of Africa. The most cited aspect, however, of these results was the high percentage of maternal Indigenous ancestry. How these findings were received within the public imagination, it actually varied. There were those who readily used these findings to uphold and promote burgeoning Indigenous resurgence movements. There were also others who said there were strong anti-Black sentiments tied up in the reception of these genetic results. Next slide. So keeping this in mind, that these studies already existed and were in public perception, we actually began conducting preliminary fieldwork in March 2017. And community members in the Piñones sector of Loíza actually expressed their dissatisfaction with how these results were talked about and thought about and used to represent the island as a whole. Moreover, in response to media reaction, they actually felt excluded from the island-wide genetic picture that tended to emphasize Indigenous American ancestry to the exclusion of other, namely African, ancestry. The sentiments of the community members in Piñones are actually consistent with what other scholars working on Blackness in Puerto Rico have observed with regards to nationalist recognitions of African heritage while maintaining Black Puerto Ricans within social and political spheres. Related to this issue raised by the community is also an issue of how the researchers sampled for these studies. In the studies that I showed you before, oftentimes they relied on census-based samples. From the standpoint of population genetics, this seems like a reasonable approach to take. However, if we put our anthropology hats on and think more like social scientists, we also have to wonder who shows up in a census and why. People may have reasons to participate in the census. They might also have reasons not to. The question we then have to ask are population genetic studies off of these censuses, are they truly representative of the population? Are they really going to give us an indication of who lives where and the different communities you might be interested in studying? So in recognition of these issues, our community partnership was actually forged, specifically to explore African ancestry within these communities and to expand this kind of regionally beyond the island, but to think about African experience in the Caribbean as a whole. So let's get into some of the details of our collaboration. In this collaboration, we really aim to explore genetic ancestry and the meaning of genetic ancestry as it was encountered by the people who with we work. So we wanted genetic ancestry from the outset to be a tool of empowerment. People already have ways of thinking about the past and their ancestors, and that will influence who says yes to be in your study and who says no. It will also influence how they understand genetic ancestry technology. Through this study, it was our intent to give people the opportunity to co-construct the meaning of genetic ancestry and their results. So within the project, we had we still have three main goals. This is an ongoing work. But the first was really to add another dimension, more to the discussion, to the population genetic work that had already been done. So we wanted to first identify the genetic origins of Afro-Puerto Ricans. We also were interested in examining how Afro-Puerto Ricans understand biological and cultural dimensions of their past. A third goal was really to facilitate local artistic interpretations of genetic ancestry and community history. So here we want to give the data back and allow the community in their own medium, in their own voice, to tell us what it is they understand and how they are interpreting the genetic data. The overall larger goal of the project really was to comment on the experiences of African descendants on the island and examine the intertwining of biology and culture in this context. Aside from the logistics of doing this study, one of the scholarly challenges we faced was how to appropriately define the study population. As I mentioned, this was something that we were thinking about because of the previous papers that had been published. And this was actually a question that I sat with a lot and discussed with my collaborators. But I was particularly interested in tackling this, given my experience and background in working in the Anglophone Caribbean. In this particular case, I really had to think about what is the best approach to the idea of Blackness in Puerto Rico. Prior to going to the field, I was aware of the politics of identity in Puerto Rico, especially with those identifying specifically as Afro-Puerto Rican. I knew that at times it could be contentious. A lot of this tension really stems from the idea that within Puerto Rico, there's a national narrative of a tricultural heritage. And we've mentioned this, and it shows up in those early genetic studies. This assertion of a tricultural heritage includes an inability to claim any one ancestry over the other. So while people may claim to have ancestry from Africa, from Europe, or from the Americas, for some Puerto Ricans to emphasize any particular ancestry, it actually becomes a very political statement. So despite this national narrative and the complexities of self-identification, we actually encountered a contingent on the island that strongly identify with their African heritage. And this is evident in our field work. You can find evidence of this on online forums, different community groups, in academic circles. In addition, there are scholars that have specifically studied various aspects of what Blackness means within a Puerto Rican context. So pictured here are some books that we've come across written by anthropologists, by sociologists, and all of these really highlight the complexities of race and racism within Puerto Rico. In addition, down here in the corner, I've also included an article that was published, I believe, early last year. So it was published in the New York Times, and it was about questions on the census of self-identification race, but specifically for Afro-Puerto Ricans. So I want to spend some time now briefly going into the actual genetic study. I will be kind of skipping over the nuts and bolts of the study, but that's really just to get to the fun stuff and talk about community engagement. So for our sampling method, we actually employed several qualitative and ethnographic methods in order to obtain a more critical and attentive approach to population as it exists and as it's experienced among Afro-descendants. Specifically, the study itself was a community-based project. From the outset, local community members were incorporated and intellectually invested into the study. We also spent a considerable amount of time in the community before any sample was collected, getting to know people and having people know who we are. In addition, my collaborators conducted both structured and unstructured interviews in which they collected information on genealogies, on family histories, on community histories, ideas about racial classification, and already the existing ideas about genetics and genetic ancestry. All of this was used to help us figure out who to sample, where to sample, and to shape the research design. In terms of the logistics of the study, we only recruited from adults and those who identified or self-identified as having ancestry, recent ancestry within Puerto Rico. So here's a screenshot of our very first kind of sampling attempt. This was from spring 2017. So we got 30 samples from different communities. I'll show you some analyses that are based on just these 30 samples. Since then, we were able to go back and double the sample size, and then the global pandemic hit, and we haven't been able to ask anybody to spit in a tube for a while. Okay? But this is an ongoing project. So you're kind of seeing the results of a pilot study. In terms of methodology, here's the basic outline of how the study was done. So first and foremost, you always get institutional IRB approvals. With that, after that, you get informed consent, okay, from all of your participants. This, for me, at least the way we conduct research, it takes a little while. I need to be very confident that you understand what I'm doing with your DNA, and you understand, like, you can get it back if you want, and what I'm going to be doing with it. From there, the samples the genetic samples are collected via saliva. I take that to my lab, I do the extractions, set up library prep, and then we genotype them on different microarrays. After that, then we do our data analysis. So in the corner, I have a list of some of the analyses that we actually do. I'll walk through the results of some of this. Again, I can't get into the details just for lack of time of how these analyses actually work. But the upshot is that they tell us about different aspects of an individual's ancestry. Next slide. So some detail about the data analysis. The chip that we use, the bead array that we actually use, it contains 750,000 genetic markers from across the genome. And we had that for 30 people. And then implementing a variety of quality control measures, including getting rid of genetic markers that didn't work well, when samples kind of were behaving in ways that were unexpected. Our final data set, we end up with almost 700,000 genome-wide markers, and we were able to retain all the people we sampled in the study. Moving right into results. So with this slide, I'm showing you the results from the mitochondrial haplogroups. So for those of you who are not as familiar with genetics, mitochondria are organelles, little organs in our cells, and they're responsible for energy production. What's really interesting about mitochondria is that they actually have their own DNA. So this is DNA that is outside of the nucleus in your cell. Unlike the DNA that's in the nucleus of your cell, mitochondrial DNA has a different inheritance pattern. A woman, or actually everybody has it, but women only pass it on to all of their children. Of those children, only the female children pass it along to future generations. So in terms of genetic ancestry, we can use mitochondrial DNA to study maternal ancestry. It will tell us something about that direct female line. So everyone in this room, for example, we all have mitochondrial DNA. It is identical to your mother, which is identical to her mother, which is identical to her mother, so on back in time. Another interesting characteristic of mitochondrial DNA is that we can look at variants, little changes in these mitochondrial DNAs, and group them together as families, and we'll call these families haplogroups. And these haplogroups tend to be continent specific, sort of. For the purposes of ancestry, we can just say they're continent specific. So there's different genetic families, different haplogroups, that if we see them, we'll know that your ancestry matches up. So if we look in our figure here, everything that I have marked in blue in this big circle is a mitochondrial haplogroup, a genetic family that we say has biogeographic ancestry to Africa. And those in green are for the Americas, and then those that are hints of orange come from, in this case, North Africa or Eurasia. In the inset, I have all the different L types, or all the other mitochondrial haplogroups that come from Africa. That's actually the distribution of them here. And the kind of broader point I want you to see is when we look at this sample of 30, we can say, yeah, 66% have sub-Saharan African ancestry. When you look at the inset, you see how variable that actually is. There's lots of different genetic families that come from Africa. So if we were to go into more detail, we could try and pick out finer grain detail as to where these lineages emerged. In our next slide, you can look at these mitochondrial haplogroups, but I threw up some comparative data that I found in the literature. And what I just really want to draw your attention to is just the different shapes of the bars. Okay, so there are some areas like Cuba where you see indigenous, European, and African ancestry at variable amounts represented on the island. And we can contrast that with Jamaica, for example, where you primarily only see African ancestry. On the very end, all the way over to the right, that's the sample group that I was working with, Afro-Puerto Ricans. And what's really interesting about Afro-Puerto Ricans is that their pattern for mitochondrial DNA looks a little bit different than general populace Puerto Ricans. So this is one of those things I was talking about. We have to think about sampling, right? So we're getting very different pictures in terms of the maternal ancestries between Puerto Ricans that are sort of described as general populace, and then Afro-Puerto Ricans. Different ancestries, different sort of history. So there's ways to think about that. We can do similar things with the Y chromosome. So the Y chromosome is the genetic material that's responsible for making males male. And it's generally inherited unchanged from father to son. So we can use the Y chromosome to look at the paternal lineage. And like mitochondrial DNA, we can organize Y chromosomes into genetic families known as haplogroups. And again, these haplogroups are somewhat continent specific. So in this pie graph, you can see the distribution of the different types of Y chromosome haplogroups that we found. Again, we see a strong paternal ancestry from Africa. We also see, as expected, influx from Europe. But then we also see what's pictured in green. So this is paternal ancestry from indigenous Americans. And this was a really novel find. In all of the studies that I'd seen in Puerto Rico, where they had these huge sample sizes, 400, 500 people, they'd never seen QM3, that green segment there. Okay, so what was concluded was that indigenous men did not contribute to modern Puerto Rican communities. And I have to argue that, yeah, actually they did, but it was in Afro-Puerto Rican communities. And this is actually a trend that needs, that I've seen elsewhere in the Caribbean. When I look at indigenous or maroon communities, I see signatures of indigenous ancestry that I don't see in the general population. And this is indicative of us needing really to take another look at what actually happened on these islands and how indigenous peoples were interacting with African descendants. On this slide, I am showing you the aggregated results of the generalized ancestry. So here we're looking at autosomal DNA. So the type of DNA that is inherited from both sides of the family. If you were to take an ancestry test, you would get results based on this portion of your DNA. What I have at the top is a kind of it looks like a structure plot or an admixture plot. The way I'll ask you to read this is just sort of follow where the big blocks of color are. So we have reference populations. I've written out their names. For those of you that are familiar with genetic reference groups, these are 1,000 genome samples. So YRI stands for Yoruban. These are grouped from West Africa, and you can see the rest. Again, all the way on the right are the sample that I worked with, and this is the sample size of 30. And you can see the color blocks that are present with Afro-Puerto Ricans. And like previous studies that were done in Puerto Rico, you see evidence for genetic influx from Africans, Europeans, and indigenous people. In this figure, you'll also notice that the pattern of the blue, which in this case references European ancestry, it varies a bit relative to the general populace. Okay, so again, thinking about sampling, who are we talking about? You'll see that varies. The table on the bottom is a breakdown of the ancestral proportions of ancestry from each kind of major continental region. I don't have time to go into it, but I actually don't like to show percentages with ancestry. It's a little bit problematic, particularly because if I change the reference populations, the numbers will change. But I put it here as an instructional point. So you can sort of have a general idea of the influx, genetic impacts of African, indigenous, and European peoples in shaping contemporary Afro-Puerto Rican and Puerto Rican communities. This last row is 1,000 genomes population, so another reference population, but they're from Barbados. And I threw that in there because they're also Caribbean, and you can see that their ancestry looks a little bit different, right? So it gives us the ability to start to think about the Caribbean in more fine-scaled, higher resolution data. So this very fun and complicated looking plot is known as a principal components analysis. Without going into a stats lesson, what we're doing here is we're trying to figure out how much variation can be explained in as few components as possible. So we've got our first two components here, and you can read this figure in a similar way that you might read a map. If something is close together, it means they're genetically close together. If something's far apart, they're a little more genetically distant. So of the study group that I was working with, Afro-Puerto Ricans, they're represented in circles. And each of our poles kind of represent different major ancestral components. So in the red, those are our reference groups from Africa. In the purple, those are our reference groups from Europe. And then in the blue, our reference groups from Asia, from the Americas. What you'll notice, the circles are representing Afro-Puerto Ricans, and they're sort of smeared across the middle of the plot. So it's telling us that their ancestry is somewhere between kind of African genetic contributions and European genetic contributions. And it's smeared out there, right? So there are some Afro-Puerto Ricans who have a lot of African ancestry, and there are some Afro-Puerto Ricans who have a lot more European ancestry. So you see that variability in there. You'll also see the triangles. The triangles are that reference population. Again, they kind of pull closer to towards that purple pole. Again, indicative of who is being sampled in these. And then I threw in those from Barbados, again, so you can see how it sort of aligns with the Afro-Puerto Ricans. Here's another principal components plot. Here we're looking at different components, and we see this regional distribution that sort of separates on the one side, all the way on the right, sort of African populations and African descendant populations. And on the left side, these would be all non-African populations. And you can, again, can see how Afro-Puerto Ricans are kind of smeared in the middle of the plot, and how they lay in relation to other communities. This last plot that I'll share with you about Afro-Puerto Ricans is also principal components analysis, but this one is specific to African ancestry. So our reference groups are different West African populations. And we did this plot in order to kind of get a better idea as to what African populations may have been a source for Afro-Puerto Ricans. And what, because there's actually several things you can say about this. But what you can actually see is that Afro-Puerto Ricans tend to cluster with Upper Guinea. So those would be reference groups represented in green. We see clustering with Lower Guinea. So those would be reference groups referenced in orange. And then to a lesser extent, we see clustering of Afro-Puerto Ricans with West Central Africans in pink. Okay, so we're getting an idea of this is the region of Africa that many Afro-Puerto Ricans came from. Again, I included other Caribbean samples in here so you can see kind of the pattern. With Barbados, you get a bit of a different pattern. We see that they tend to cluster only with groups from Lower Guinea. So those, again, in orange. So as I interpret this, what it seems to suggest is that there was different influxes, right, of different African peoples coming into the Caribbean. And there may be some unrecognized heterogeneity within these communities. We all might say, yeah, they're Afro-Caribbean or Afro this and Afro that, where their ancestries within Africa actually look a little bit different. For those of you interested in like genetic counseling or personalized genetic medicine, this potentially could have some impact in thinking about different risk susceptibilities, et cetera. But again, this is something that has to be studied a bit more. There's a lot more that I can say about this plot, but I think I'm gonna move on and talk a little bit about some of the comparative work that I've done. So I initiated with some colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania and National Geographic some work with indigenous communities in St. Vincent, Garifuna, and in Trinidad, First Peoples community of Arima. In terms of the methodology, it was pretty similar to what I've done for the Afro-Puerto Rican project. If you're really interested, there's a screenshot of the paper that's been published, but you can read about the details there. Looking at their maternal ancestry, so focusing again on the haplogroups, you'll see that between Afro-Puerto Ricans and Trinidad and St. Vincent, some of the same mitochondrial haplogroups show up. However, in Trinidad and St. Vincent, we see these really high numbers of indigenous maternal ancestry. Okay, and again, this is a testament to the continuity and the survival of indigenous peoples in this region of the Caribbean. This last haplogroup, go back one more, sorry. This last haplogroup on the end, M33, that's actually a haplogroup that's pretty common in South Asia, in India, right? And this totally makes sense in the context of Trinidad because of the huge influx of people from India shortly after emancipation to kind of fill labor voids left by emancipation. We can also consider paternal ancestries by looking at the Y chromosome. And again, based on these genetic haplogroups, or these Y chromosome haplogroups, we see expected ancestry where we know we would see it. So Africa, Europe, and Asia. And again, we see the influx or the representation of male indigenous ancestry among these groups. Again, something that is not common in the general populace, but is specific to these marginalized populations. Here I have another structure plot. This one looks a little bit different than previous plots I showed you. Again, these are 1,000 genome reference populations. On this end, ACB again stands for those from Barbados. And then there's a variety of African populations. The study populations I work with are all the way on the end. I put them on the box and you kind of look up the columns. And what you can see here is that both Trinidad and St. Vincent have that red block that's indicative of African ancestry, but the other ancestries actually look a little bit different. Okay, and again, this is a signal, a sign that their history is a little bit different. The histories of who was coming into these islands, who was mixing, a little bit different, and we see these signatures reflected in the DNA And here's the last PCA that I'll show you. Okay, again, this is only Trinidad and St. Vincent and a bunch of comparative data. So that kind of brown clump you see in the middle, those are all the samples from Trinidad. Okay, and they're all on top of each other, which means that they're genetically pretty similar. This could mean that they're genetically pretty similar, or it could be a sampling artifact that I need to go back and see if I can garner more samples to get a better idea of who's there. The green triangles are the Garifuna that we see here, kind of spread also out in this plot, indicating a lot of mixed ancestry within this community. So even though I only considered these three communities, what my findings are overall kind of really telling us is that biological and social history of contact and exchange between African, Indigenous American, as well as other populations, they generally actually align with the histories of these islands. However, within many of the scholarly sources that I've come across, both Indigenous and African peoples are conceived of only up until the terms of their supposed demise and enslavement in the Americas. And a lot less attention has been given to how these populations change the political and the social and physical landscapes of the places they found themselves in. I think what's one important factor that we can't overlook when we're doing this sort of work, this ancestry work, is that communities, these communities in particular, had a role in shaping the contemporary Caribbean, and they can't be overlooked, and certainly don't want to write them out by relying on sampling methods that can erase them. So in considering the case in Puerto Rico, as well as what I've learned in St. Vincent and Trinidad, we can really appreciate how genetic technologies can be used to support existing notions of community and community identity. Though possessing different histories as well as different patterns of genetic variation, all of these communities strive for recognition and the autonomy to cultivate and shape their futures. And genetic ancestry, these tools, was just one way to help meet those goals. I'd also like to add that the recognition of heterogeneity among African descendants in the Caribbean and the Americas more broadly, it really has implications for related fields. As I've mentioned, it could be genetic epidemiology, population genetics, personalized genetic medicine, genetic counseling. The variation that we see within the African diaspora, it really has the potential to offer some exciting opportunities to really more fully understand how the juxtaposition of biology and culture work together to shape patterns of variation, as well as different health outcomes. So as the use of genetic technologies fits into a larger community, and fits into larger community efforts to maintain, define, and assert what it means to be a piñonero, we found that the sociocultural context in which people encounter genetic ancestry, it provides a prism for what genetic ancestry means and ultimately what value it carries. This emphasis is important. It's an important point, specifically because genetic technologies have no natural relationship to how people interpret genetic information. And that point often gets lost when academics only characterize genetic ancestry as a tool that reifies biological race concepts. I hope I've convinced you by showing you some of our shared work that these tools can also be used as a way to empower communities, to give them an opportunity to tell their stories in their own ways. I think it's also important to note and to acknowledge that it may be impossible to disentangle science from social context. In other words, when it comes to humans studying humans, the scientific method alone can't guarantee a reasonable objective outcome. We have to look more holistically.
All right, so let's begin contextualizing the genetic data. We don't have much left. What I want to do here to start, moving towards a conclusion is to give you two community efforts that are keys. They're integral in interpreting all the genetic data that you've seen. And we come to these axioms of interpretation through community engaged research. That's the only way you come to it. You have to talk to people, say, hey, this is what the genetics are showing, and then you have to sit with them through that and their lives. There's no way around it. It's not an in and out with genetics. So what do we come up with? What we call mangrove politics. There are two elements to this. One of them is the first one. We'll start with the mangroves. The mangroves, as I said, they're ancestral homelands, and they're pretty important for the way in which Piñoneros, the people of Piñones, imagine and think about their contemporary African ancestry. All right, and so when they talk about these mangroves and the maintenance of the mangroves, it's never just purely an environmental conservation effort. There's much more at stake, right? And so we think it is important to think about this genetic ancestry in this context. So the project is being carried out with a federal grant in conjunction with the Department of Natural Resources in Puerto Rico, and a lot of community involvement. All the people pictured on this, on the picture of the pictures that sits outside of a copy are people from the community. These are folks that come in and are there cleaning up the mangrove. What does that mean? Cleanup means clearing channels. Mangroves have channels that are very important for the water to circulate between the ocean and the lagoons and then back into the ocean. If they're so important, how come they're not naturally there? Well, those channels got cut off when the area of Piñones had a main road going through, and nobody asked the people of Piñones or did an environmental impact assessment. They just built it. So they closed up all the channels. So all the channels have to be cleaned and renewed so that Piñones doesn't flood. So very straightforward. And it's also important for the conservation of the biodiversity of the mangroves themselves, right? So, and animals and plants do better when the mangroves are healthier. How is that tied to ancestry? Well, a lot of the folk knowledge and understanding of yourself as a community through spirituality, through medicine, folk medicine, is embedded in the mangrove. So the health of the mangrove is associated with the health of the community. It's also a source of income through ecotourism. This is a bioluminescent bay. Most people in Puerto Rico do not know that this is a bioluminescent bay. People think it's either in the East Coast or the Southwest, but it's there. It's not very shiny because it's dirty, because it's flooded. So the mud floods it. But this is a beautiful resource that is really, the mangrove forest here is bigger than anything else on the island. But even people in Puerto Rico don't realize it. Education efforts. COPI does a lot. So at the same time that, I was switching over here, but not over there. So these are the cleanup efforts. You can see it's a lot of hard labor. You have to get in the water and cut down some very hard roots. Education efforts. At the same time that we're taking ancestry saliva samples and we're doing interviews, this is happening in COPI. Youth are coming in and they're learning about the mangrove forest and about conservation, right? Often when we think about race and politics, we think about activism, we don't think about science and ecology and conservation. But these folks do it all naturally, okay? And so this is that's the first person for thinking about genetic ancestry. And I like to think of the mangrove roots, since they are so intertangled, as sort of metaphorical for genetic pasts, okay? The second component is Bomba. COPI and Piñones is home to the Ballet Folclórico Internacional Majestad Negra. So Majestad Negra is a pretty badass Bomba group. They are doing some wonderful things. Been around for 21 years. They've traveled internationally to Cuba, Ecuador, St. Croix, the US, and Tanzania. They are pretty unique as a Bomba group too. I'm not putting any other Bomba group down, but these are my folks, so I have to give them their props. They do some interesting things. Number one is that they've been doing Bomba education classes for the community for many, many years. And when they teach Bomba, they teach a contemporary dance. So many people will tell you Bomba is a folkloric dance. At Kopi, it is folkloric dance, but it's more than a folkloric dance. It's a dance of people who are living, breathing, and building something for themselves. This is why they don't wear traditional dresses. They experiment a lot with dresses that are not traditional in their color. They reject what they call servants' dresses. They don't want to be dressed like servants from colonial eras. They want to be dressed how they want to be dressed now. Now, you need to have some functionality, so you still need to be able to have the skirts that work the right way, because dancing involves the skirts. But they do something that I think is really important for interpreting the genetic data that Jada so wonderfully covered, and that is that they seek to build diaspora. Bomba is usually in place. It is, I would like to say, incarcerated in Puerto Rican folklore as something Black. And from Kopi, they say, no, it's something Black, but it's not something Black that belongs to the island. They try to move outside of Puerto Rico and build diasporic communities through interchanges with other groups of Afro-descendants who play similar musics. And that is sort of the same sort of thing that we do when we go out searching for our ancestors. Where are they from? Where do people come from other islands? What's going on? The genetic ancestry has to be understood this way. So I have a couple of show and tell things. I know we're running out of time, so I don't want to skip the videos. That would be bad. This is taken from a phone in Cuba, in Santiago de Cuba. Now I want to pick on this one because this is with a group that dances La Tumba Francesa. So Tumba Francesa is a particular Afro-Cuban dance form from Eastern Cuba, but with origins in Haiti in the 1790s. Not a minor incident in the Americas, the Haitian Revolution. So Haitian migrants come to East Cuba, get with Afro-Cubans in the East Coast, and this dance form is born into existence. And years later, come Afro-Puerto Ricans with their dance form to create diaspora. Okay. So this happens with streaming. So I'm going to stop right there because we got to in slow. It was an awkward slow motion. On the right, you saw the members of Majestad Negra in Puerto Rico with their verses, and you saw on the left the older folks from the group that practices the Tumba Francesa, and they embrace and they dance together. And this is common. So this is, I'll bring you to a second example. This has just happened last October, and this was with Garifuna International Folkloric Ballet here from New York City. So I'm sure you can look them up and see what they're doing because they're around. They came to Puerto Rico and they had 2 days of close workshops where they talked with one another, where they played music together, and they had this public event. And at the end of this public event, just like in Cuba, they built diaspora. And it's a disobedience of folkloric genres. You're supposed to be proper and do things right. They don't do that. So Bomba, like many African musical traditions in the Americas, involves dancers dictating what the drums do, right? So this guy is following what she's doing, right? But she's not a trained Bomba dancer. She's a Garifuna dancer. So new things are being born, new sounds, new rhythms are being created through these encounters. I like to think of, this is the same thing of, this is Jada's plots, right? Where you see the stretching out of different populations and different colors and different referent populations. As a cultural anthropologist, this is what I like. Same colors, less acronyms. Sorry, I think I win the show and tell. But so there you see another dancer doing their thing. And I have I have another video, but it's a higher resolution, so I don't have much faith that it'll work. But it's a video that the people of Kopi put together for public viewership. We'll let it play as long as it's not too tedious, but I just want to show you that as a process of community and diaspora building.
Que bailaré, usted corrido de bomba, yo bailaré. Yo bailaré, la bomba de Loíza, yo bailaré. Yo bailaré, usted corrido de bomba, yo bailaré. Oye, los carizonas bailan con sabor, la bomba de Loíza y con mucho amor. Oye, los carizonas bailan con mucho amor, la bomba de Loíza y con sabor. Bailaré, la bomba de Loíza, yo bailaré, yo bailaré, usted corrido de bomba, yo bailaré, toco, 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 ay, toco, 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 rucutá, 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 rucutá. Bueno, señores, esto ha sido un encuentro amistoso entre Honduras y Puerto Rico, nuestros hermanos garífonos que han venido a compartir con el pueblo puertorriqueño en el 20 aniversario del ballet folclórico Majestad Negra. No será, es la primera y la última vez que nos encontremos en estos eventos culturales, pueblos hermanos de la misma sangre, de esa africanidad que llevamos por dentro. Honduras, felices. Los queremos, seguiremos compartiendo esas visiones ancestrales que tenemos de lo que es el tambor y nuestra música. El ballet folclórico internacional Majestad Negra, de una comunidad de negros y marrones, Piñones, le abre las puertas a ustedes y siempre estarán con nosotros y en nuestro corazón.
It worked. Love it. You gotta talk smack about it so it works. Let's see how it goes. Okay, so again, I see that intermixing of dancing, and I interpret genetic ancestry with my interlocutors through those movements of people, through that intermingling. In conclusion, we want to suggest that there's a lot more of what we talked about today happening throughout the Americas. This is all a matter of politics. The junction of genetic ancestry, conservation of the mangroves, and diasporic Bomba is an effort to build political foundations for anti-racism. But anti-racism is not static and bound by the nation state. Political futures demand birthing of new body politics, and in this case, body politics centered by racial experience. Thank you. I know, that's why I try to rush through it.
Thank you so much for that incredibly interesting and really unique presentation. Pleasure to have you guys here. I was wondering when I was reading your work and listening to you, what you guys think about the ancestry testing craze that's gone on since about 2016, 2017. Genetic ancestry went from being like, stamp collecting or I don't know, polka dancing or whatever, something that some people did, to something that millions of people were doing. And I personally have very mixed feelings about what's going on with that. That it's, in some ways, it allows people access to a history that they might have been cut off from. And in other ways, it is built into sort of reified ideas of what that history is. The boxes are already set up. I mean, I was thinking when you said this is from African ancestry, that if you really traced it all back, it's all from African ancestry, right? Like you go far enough back. So it's sort of like privileging a moment in time. So in terms of the positives and negatives of the genetic ancestry craze, which do you think is more pronounced?
I think that's there's a lot to unpack, right, with that question. For people who come from communities where their histories have been systematically denied, where they're told they don't have a history worth knowing, I think genetic ancestry offers a perspective that wasn't there. And in the hands of particular communities, if you can control the dialogue around that history, I think it goes a far way to rectifying some of those histories. Obviously, there are other issues of genetic privacy, right? So when you submit your DNA, it's not just you, it's your sister, your brother, your mom, your dad, all of their information is out there too. So you have to consider these things. I am by training and by design, I'm a scientist. So I like knowledge, I like education. I think that if this is a gateway for someone to learn more about what genetics is and what genetic technology can do, how it can help their community, I'm all for it. But at the same time, I think there's some responsibility on the part of these companies to make sure that the information is correct and accessible to really understand what's going on with it. Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. But,
Thank you for a really very interesting presentation. As there is a lot of unknowns about West Indian ancestries and where the enslaved Africans came from. My question to you both is, since there is sense of blurring of lines between race as a construct and genetic ancestry, could you clarify?
sure.
Yes, we can clarify, but I want to give a meta frame for the clarification. So pedagogically, there's no anthropology class worth a cent where we don't teach a race as a social construct, and that the idea that there's a biological basis to race is just flawed. As anthropologists, we're pretty tired of this. There's over a century of saying this in classrooms. But that has a limit, right? It has a limit because the general public is often not interested, and often the way people interpret genetic ancestry is through a folk biological sense of race. And for us, that tells us something. So what do? Do we go into communities and tell people the difference between race as a social construct and the flaws of a biological concept of race? Or do we work with communities to create a form of science education, a form of public science education that can allow us to be humbled to the way in which people already experience race in the real world, and that acknowledging that, and then working with communities to present genetic ancestry as a way of understanding the past that doesn't determine who you are. So in some, we've dealt with it differently. Jada can speak about her experience in Trinidad. It's very different. In Trinidad, there were people who said, Dr. Benn Torres said that we were indigenous. They ran with it. And she said no such thing, but it appeared in the newspapers. And that's the way it went. In Puerto Rico, we're working with communities in a much more embedded form. And that last slide that I had with the Helix and the Bomba player, that's from the community. We did that with them. That's how they envision it. So we work with them in a way that they understand that their biological ancestry, even though it might be loosely related with or strongly related to the ideas of race, of African ancestry means Black, indigenous ancestry means Taino, European ancestry means Spanish. I think they get it. I think that they understand that there's a difference, but it's because we didn't approach the community with, we're going to teach a class. We approached the community with, let's work together. And what does that mean to you? So does that get, because, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but to be sure, there is no biological basis to race, and genetic ancestry is a poor way for even to think about biological race. They're not the same thing, and it's.
Okay. If I could, and I know we're kind of pressed on time, but I'll tell you a little story about something I wrote about in one of the papers I've published, and it's a story of a police sergeant. His name is Cleon Brown. He's in Hastings, Michigan. Sergeant Brown actually identified as white. Okay, you'd look at him, nobody in this room would probably be like, oh yeah, that's white guy, police officer, great. He took an ancestry test and he found out he had 18% African ancestry. He thought, he was tickled. He's like, oh, that's cool. He went to work and he told folks about this. And then nooses started showing up on his desk. He was systematically, not told about meetings he was supposed to show up at. He got other sort of racist paraphernalia thrown at him and was excluded. And he didn't like it. So he filed a civil suit for $500,000 against the police department and certain people, okay, in the department. If you read the civil suit, it will say statements about Sergeant Cleon Brown took an ancestry test and found out that he's 18% African American, right? So they went from African ancestry to being African American. In the end, Sergeant Brown ended up leaving his job, but he got $65,000 in the settlement. But here in this case, it's this great illustration of how ancestry and race ethnicity can be conflated, okay? It also shows that biology is not necessary to experience racism and discrimination, okay? The only thing that changed in this instance were the values and the ideas assigned to Cleon Brown, okay, in this case. And literally one day he's white, everybody liked him. The next day they find out in their ideas that he's Black. Nothing changed about this man. He was still the same person he'd always been, right? So it tells us that our ideas about race are not only a social construct, it's experiential. And when I say that, I also kind of want to put a caveat here that all experiences of race are not negative. We can think of different examples when we are celebrating, like some of the things you saw here, that are celebratory, that are healing, that are restorative. So it's not always negative. But this particular example really just illustrates the difference between ancestry, right? You have ancestors from this part of the world, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how you self-identify. You likely have ancestors who would self-identify in a different way. Even for people of African descent who are trying to figure out where in Africa their ancestors came from, the labels that we use today, we have to think that some of these communities didn't exist 500 years ago when their ancestors may have been taken. So it's much more nuanced, much more complex. So saying that you have ancestry from a particular part of the world, that's all you're saying, is that you have ancestors that come from this part of the world. But it doesn't really have any bearing as to how and why you identify the way that you do, your racial identity.
We are past time, and I'm so glad that you took the extra time to answer that question. That was really fascinating and incredibly terse response to a question that could have been a whole another hour. Here, right? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.